A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Herman, I was walking through the old city yesterday, just listening to the layers of sound. You hear Arabic, you hear English, you hear Russian, but the dominant frequency is this sharp, modern Hebrew. And it struck me just how bizarre that actually is. If you told someone in the mid-19th century that this liturgical language of ancient scrolls would be used to argue about parking tickets or code high-level software in the 21st century, they would have called you a dreamer or a lunatic.
Or both. Honestly, Corn, it is the ultimate black swan event in linguistics. Most languages die out and stay dead. They become artifacts like Latin or ancient Greek, preserved in amber for scholars and priests. But Hebrew, it underwent a literal resurrection. Our friend and housemate Daniel was asking us about this recently. He sent over a prompt wanting us to dig into the engineering behind it. Not just the feel-good story of the revival, but the actual mechanics and the trade-offs. Because, let us be honest, you do not bring a language back from the dead without some serious linguistic surgery.
Right, and that surgery leaves scars. Daniel wanted to know about the pioneers who faced all that scorn, the pragmatism that drove the success, and how much the language actually changed. I mean, is the Hebrew we speak today even the same language King David spoke? Or is it a modern reconstruction wearing an ancient mask? It is a question of identity at its core. We are talking about a language that was silent as a mother tongue for nearly 2,000 years. Think about that. 2 millennia when no one whispered a lullaby in Hebrew or shouted a command in the heat of a moment.
That is the perfect way to frame it. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time on My Weird Prompts. And today we are looking at the linguistic engineering of Hebrew. This is not just a history lesson. It is a study in how human will can override natural linguistic decay. We are talking about a sociolinguistic project that defies every rule in the book. Usually, languages evolve through slow glacial shifts. This was a lightning strike. It was a deliberate, top-down imposition that somehow, against all odds, became a bottom-up reality.
It is fascinating because it starts with such a small group of people. We always hear about Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, the man who is basically credited with the whole thing. But the social pressure he and his family faced was immense. People literally laughed at him. In Jerusalem, the religious establishment thought it was sacrilegious to use the holy tongue for mundane things like asking for a towel or talking about the weather. They saw it as a desecration. To them, Hebrew was for the heavens, not the gutter.
Ben-Yehuda was an extremist in the best sense of the word. He moved to Jerusalem in 1881 and decided his home would be the first Hebrew-only household in centuries. He supposedly would not let his wife speak any other language to their son, Itamar ben Avi. There is this famous story that when the boy was a toddler and his father caught the mother whispering a Russian lullaby to him, Ben-Yehuda flew into a rage. He saw any other language as a contaminant. It sounds harsh, but that kind of fanaticism was the only way to break the inertia of 2,000 years. He was fighting against the entire weight of history.
It is that classic burn the ships mentality. But fanaticism only gets you so far. You can have one family speaking Hebrew, but how do you get a whole society of immigrants from Poland, Morocco, Germany, and Yemen to drop their native tongues? That is where the pragmatism comes in. Was it the necessity of a common tongue for the state of Israel that finally pushed it over the edge? Because when you have people arriving from every corner of the globe, you need a bridge. You cannot build a country if nobody understands the person standing next to them.
That was the catalyst, but the groundwork was laid much earlier. You have to remember the context of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You had the first Aliyah and second Aliyah, these waves of Jewish immigrants coming back to the land. They spoke dozens of different languages. If you are a farmer from Russia working next to a farmer from Romania, you need a bridge. Yiddish was an option for some, but it carried the weight of the diaspora, and it did not work for the Jews coming from Islamic lands who spoke Ladino or Judeo. Arabic. Hebrew was the only neutral, unifying choice. It was the common denominator. It belonged to everyone because it belonged to no one as a daily vernacular.
So it was a political and social necessity. But then you hit the technical wall. If you are building a modern society, you need words for things that did not exist in the time of the prophets. I remember we touched on the evolution of language back in episode 845, but Hebrew is a unique case because they had to manufacture an entire technical lexicon almost overnight. How do you say electricity, or airplane, or screwdriver in a language that stopped developing around the time of the Roman Empire?
Oh, the neologisms are where it gets really fun. Ben-Yehuda and the later Hebrew Language Committee, which was established in 1890, had to be incredibly creative. They used the Shoresh system, the three-letter root system that is the backbone of Semitic languages. For example, they took the root for word, which is mem, lamed, hey, and created million for dictionary. They took the word hashmal, which appears in the book of Ezekiel and probably meant some kind of glowing metal or amber, and they repurposed it to mean electricity. It was a brilliant bit of linguistic recycling.
That is brilliant, actually. It gives the language this feeling of continuity even when it is being modernized. But there was a massive fight about this, right? The Language War of 1913. That feels like a pivotal moment for the pragmatism we are talking about. It was not just about words. It was about power and the future of the entire Zionist project.
It was the turning point. The Technion, which was being built in Haifa as a technical university, was funded by the Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden, a German Jewish organization. Naturally, they wanted the language of instruction to be German. At the time, German was the global language of science and engineering. It made logical sense. Why try to teach complex physics in a language that did not even have a word for molecule yet? But the students and teachers revolted. They realized that if Hebrew was not the language of the elite, of the scientists and the engineers, it would forever be a second-class language, a language of the past rather than the future.
And they won. That strike basically forced the hand of the establishment. It proved that Hebrew was not just for poets and rabbis, it was for the future. It was a declaration of independence before the state even existed. But this leads to one of Daniel's big questions. How much did the language deviate from its origins during this rush to modernize? When you are forcing a language to grow that fast, you have to make compromises. You are essentially grafting a modern engine onto an ancient chassis.
Huge compromises. This is what linguists call relexification or sometimes even creolization. Modern Hebrew is structurally very different from Biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is what we call a VSO language, meaning the verb usually comes before the subject and object. Modern Hebrew shifted to an SVO structure, subject-verb, object, which is much more common in European languages like English or Russian. So, while the words might look ancient, the way they are strung together is very modern.
So, even though the words looked the same on the page, the brain of the language changed to match the European speakers who were reviving it? It is like the language was rewired to fit a different operating system.
And that brings us to the phonetic loss, which is something Daniel specifically asked about. If you listen to a modern Israeli speaker today, and then you listen to a Yemenite Jew chanting the Torah, or you listen to an Arabic speaker, you notice a massive difference in the throat. The ancient Semitic sounds, the gutturals, have mostly disappeared from standard modern Hebrew. We are talking about the loss of the pharyngeal consonants that give Semitic languages their distinct texture.
Right, the ayin and the het. For our listeners who do not speak Hebrew, these are deep pharyngeal sounds made in the back of the throat. In modern Hebrew, the ayin is usually silent, just a glottal stop or nothing at all, and the het is merged with the kaf to become a raspy sound further up in the mouth. It is like we lost the bass notes of the language. It sounds flatter, more European.
We did, and it was not an accident, it was a result of who was doing the speaking. The early pioneers were overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, meaning they came from Europe. Their mouths were not trained for those deep Semitic pharyngeals. They found them difficult to pronounce, and frankly, some of them viewed those sounds as Oriental or primitive. They wanted a language that sounded modern, which to them meant European. There was a conscious and subconscious push to align the sound of Hebrew with the prestige languages of the West.
That is such an interesting tension. You are reviving an ancient Middle Eastern language, but you are trimming off the Middle Eastern parts of the sound to make it fit a European palate. It is a form of linguistic engineering that really reflects the cultural biases of that era. They wanted the history, but they did not necessarily want the phonology.
It really does. There was actually a debate about which pronunciation to adopt. The Sephardic pronunciation, used by Jews from Spain and the Middle East, was officially chosen as the standard because it was seen as more authentic to the Hebrew of the Golden Age. But in practice, what emerged was a hybrid. We kept the Sephardic vowels, but the Ashkenazi consonants and the European cadence. It is a bit of a linguistic Frankenstein, but it works. It is functional, it is expressive, and it is alive.
But wait, if we lost that phonetic richness, is it gone forever? Daniel asked if Hebrew is now set in stone, or if it could continue to evolve. I mean, we live in Jerusalem, and I definitely hear some younger people or people from certain backgrounds bringing back a bit more of that Het Nine sound. Is there a chance of a phonetic revival? Or has the standardization trap already snapped shut?
It is possible, but linguistics usually moves towards simplification, not complexity. Once a language loses a phoneme, it is very hard to get it back into the general population. However, we are seeing something interesting. With the rise of Mizrahi culture in Israel, which is the culture of Jews from Arab lands, those sounds have a new prestige. They are in the music, they are in the media. But for the average person in Tel Aviv, the ayin remains silent. The language has standardized around a very efficient, somewhat flattened phonology. It is the price of being a national language.
It is efficient, but do you think we lost something essential? When you lose the distinction between a tet and a tav, which both sound like T now, or a ket and a kaf, you create a lot of homophones, words that sound the same but mean different things. Does that make the language less precise? In English, we have that problem all the time, but Hebrew was built on these very specific phonetic distinctions.
It makes it more dependent on context. But every language does this. The real loss is the connection to the poetic structure of the Bible. The puns and wordplay in the Tanakh often rely on those phonetic distinctions. When you read the original text with a modern Israeli accent, some of that depth is flattened out. It is like looking at a three-dimensional sculpture through a two-dimensional photograph. You get the image, but you lose the texture. You lose the resonance that the original authors intended.
That is a great analogy. It reminds me of what we discussed in episode 799 about language attrition. Except here, it is not an individual losing a language. It is a whole culture attriting certain parts of its ancient tongue to make it functional for the modern world. It is the price of admission for a living language. If you want a language to be spoken by millions of people in a noisy, fast-paced world, it cannot be overly precious about its ancient phonology. You have to be able to shout it over the sound of a bus or a crowded market.
Pragmatism over purism. That was the secret sauce. If the pioneers had insisted on every speaker mastering the deep pharyngeal ayin before they were allowed to speak, the revival would have failed. They chose accessibility over accuracy. They let the language be broken so that it could be whole again as a living vernacular. They prioritized the speaker over the scholar.
Let us dig a bit deeper into that standardization trap Daniel mentioned. Because today we have the Academy of the Hebrew Language. They are the official gatekeepers. They invent new words for podcast and sushi and firewall. But does that top-down control actually work anymore? Or has the street Hebrew taken over? In the early days, the committee was essential, but now that the language is out in the wild, can you really control it?
The street always wins eventually. Corn. Always. The Academy is fascinating because it is one of the few places in the world where people actually care about linguistic prescriptions. They will put out a list of new words, and sometimes they stick, like merkazat for a telephone switchboard. But other times, the public just says no. For example, the Academy tried to push the word padalet for a terrace or balcony, but everyone just keeps saying merbiset, and don't even get me started on the word for socks.
Or podcast. Did they ever find a good word for that? I feel like we should know this, considering we are recording one.
They tried hesket. It is actually a pretty good word derived from the root for listening. And you do hear it on the national radio stations, but if you are talking to a friend, you probably just say podcast. This is the tension. Hebrew is now a normal language. And normal languages are messy. They borrow from English, they use Arabic slang like sababa or yalla, and they ignore the grammar rules taught in school. They are influenced by global trends and local subcultures.
It is the ultimate sign of success, isn't it? The fact that people feel comfortable enough with Hebrew to ruin it. If the language were still a fragile museum piece, we would be much more careful with it. But because it is robust and healthy, we can treat it with the same casual disregard we treat English. We can bend it, break it, and fill it with slang. That is what a living language looks like.
That is a brilliant point. The highest compliment you can pay to the revival pioneers is to speak bad Hebrew. It means the language is no longer a project, it is a reality. But I want to go back to the idea of the language of the state versus the language of the people. Because we hold conservative views, we often talk about the importance of national identity and the role of the state in preserving culture. In the case of Hebrew, the state played a massive role. The army, the schools, the national media, they all enforced Hebrew. Do you think it could have happened without that state power, or was the social pressure enough?
Honestly, probably not. You need a forcing function when you are dealing with such a massive demographic shift. When you have hundreds of thousands of refugees arriving with nothing in common but their religion, the state has to provide the linguistic glue. It is a pro-sovereignty argument, really. A nation needs a language to define its borders, not just physically, but culturally. Hebrew provided the mental border for the state of Israel. It created a shared reality where one did not exist before.
And it was a defensive move too. If they had not pushed Hebrew, Israel would have become a collection of linguistic enclaves. You would have had a Russian neighborhood, a German neighborhood, a Ladino neighborhood. It would have looked like the Tower of Babel. By choosing Hebrew, a language that belonged to everyone and no one simultaneously, they created a level playing field. It was a masterstroke of social engineering. It prevented the balkanization of the society before it even got off the ground.
But let us look at the flip side. Some people argue that in the process of creating this standard Israeli Hebrew, we crushed a lot of beautiful diaspora dialects. The Yiddish-influenced Hebrew of the old Yishuv, the melodic Hebrew of the Moroccan Jews. Is the standardization a trap because it makes the language more monotonous? Are we losing the diversity that makes a culture rich?
It is a trade-off. You lose local color, but you gain national cohesion. It is the same thing that happened in France with the suppression of regional dialects like Occitan in favor of Parisian French. It is often a brutal process, but it is how modern nation-states are built. In Israel's case, it was even more urgent because the survival of the state was literally at stake. You cannot run an army if the sergeant speaks Yiddish and the private speaks Arabic and the radio operator speaks Greek. You need instant, unambiguous communication.
True. But now that the state is established and secure, are we seeing a loosening of that grip? I feel like modern Hebrew is becoming more elastic. We are seeing more influences from the diaspora coming back in. Even English influence, which some people hate, is a sign that Hebrew is part of the global conversation. It is no longer in a defensive crouch.
It is definitely elastic. And that brings us to the future. Daniel asked if the phonology could continue to evolve. I think we might see a divergence. We might end up with a high Hebrew used for formal occasions and a street Hebrew that continues to simplify. We already see this with the way the future tense is used. In formal Hebrew, you have distinct forms, but on the street, people often just use the prefix lamed and the infinitive. It is a natural move toward a more analytic structure, like English. The language is shedding its complex inflections in favor of speed and ease.
So, Hebrew might actually become easier over time? That would be a relief for anyone currently struggling with the 7-verb binyanim.
Most languages do as they become more widely spoken by non-native speakers. But here is the kicker. Hebrew has this incredible anchor in the form of the ancient texts. Because every Israeli child learns the Bible in the original Hebrew, the language can never drift too far away. It is like a kite. It can fly pretty high and move with the wind, but it is always tethered to that 3,000-year-old string. You can't just invent a whole new grammar because the old one is sitting right there in the foundational texts of the culture.
That is what makes it unique. In episode 1031, we talked about the close of language, the script, and the visual evolution. Even though the letters changed from the ancient Paleo-Hebrew to the square Aramaic script we use today, the core code remained the same. An Israeli teenager today can pick up a scroll found in a cave from 2,000 years ago and read a significant portion of it. That is a level of continuity that almost no other culture has. Can you imagine an English speaker trying to read Beowulf without a translation? It is impossible. But for a Hebrew speaker, the past is accessible.
It is a superpower, and it is one that was intentionally preserved. The pioneers were very careful not to break the link to the past while they were building the bridge to the future. They kept the root system. They kept the basic morphology. They just upgraded the operating system to handle modern hardware. They ensured that the language remained recognizable to its ancestors while being useful to its descendants.
So, if we're looking for takeaways here, what is the lesson for other endangered languages? We see movements to revive Irish or Welsh or various indigenous languages in the Americas. Can they follow the Hebrew model? Or was the Hebrew revival a one-off because of the unique historical circumstances of the Jewish people? Is it a repeatable experiment or a miracle that can't be replicated?
It is a bit of both. You need the will and you need the need. Most language revivals fail because there is no practical need to speak the language. If you can get by perfectly well in English or Spanish, why bother with the immense effort of reviving a dying tongue? Hebrew succeeded because it was a matter of survival. It was the only way to build a unified society from a fragmented people. It was not just a hobby, it was a necessity.
So the lesson is pragmatism. If you want to save a language, you have to make it useful. You have to make it the language of the grocery store and the laboratory, not just the language of the museum and the folk song. You have to be willing to let it get dirty.
You have to be willing to let it change. You have to let it be ugly and modern. If you try to keep it in a glass case, it will die. The pioneers of Hebrew were willing to get their hands dirty. They were willing to take an ancient, sacred tongue and use it to talk about sewage systems and tax codes. That is what saved it. They desacralized it to save its life.
It is a powerful thought. The scorn and derision they faced was because they were desacralizing the language, but in doing so, they gave it life. It is a classic conservative paradox. To preserve something truly valuable, you sometimes have to transform it. You have to change the form to save the essence.
Well said, Korn. I think we have covered a lot of ground here. We looked at the fanaticism of Ben-Yehuda, the pragmatism of the language war, the phonetic trade-offs we made, and why the language structure changed to match its new speakers. We have seen how a dead language can become a living, breathing thing through sheer force of will and practical necessity.
And I think we addressed Daniel's questions. The revival was driven by a mix of ideological fire and cold, hard necessity. We did lose the phonetic richness of the gutturals, but we gained a functional, modern tongue. And as for being set in stone, the street is proving every day that Hebrew is as alive and changing as any other language. It is not a monument, it is a workshop.
It is a linguistic miracle, no doubt about it. Living here in Jerusalem, you see it every day. It is easy to take it for granted, but every time you hear a toddler babbling in Hebrew, you are witnessing something that was considered impossible 150 years ago. You are hearing the sound of a resurrection.
It really is something. Well, I think that is a good place to wrap up our core discussion. Herman, any final practical takeaways for our listeners who might be interested in linguistics or cultural preservation?
I would say, look at the Shorish system. If you're learning Hebrew or even just interested in how it works, understanding those three-letter roots is like having the source code for the entire language. It shows you how logical and engineered the language really is. It is a beautiful system of permutations and combinations. And for those interested in preservation, remember that a language lives in the mouths of the people, not in the books of the academy. If you want to save a language, speak it, even if you speak it badly.
Great advice. And hey, if you have been listening to my weird prompts for a while and you are enjoying these deep dives, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and keeps us going. We are a small operation, and every bit of support counts.
It really does. We love doing this, and your feedback means a lot. You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today like episodes 799 and 1031, at our website, myweirdprompts.com. There is an RSS feed there, and a contact form if you want to send us your own weird prompts. We are always looking for new rabbit holes to dive down.
We are also on Spotify, obviously, so make sure to follow us there so you never miss an episode. We have over 1,000 episodes in the archive now, covering everything from battery chemistry to ancient history, so there is plenty to explore. We have been at this for a long time, and we are not stopping anytime soon.
Thanks to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It is always good to talk about the language we live and breathe every day. It is easy to forget how extraordinary it is when you are just using it to buy milk.
Well, this has been my weird prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Until next time, keep asking the weird questions.
Shalom from Jerusalem.
So, Herman, before we go, I have to ask, do you think you could ever bring back the ayin? I mean, you have a pretty good range. You were a choir boy once, right?
Oh, I have tried, Corn. I have tried. But every time I do it in a coffee shop, the barista just looks at me like I'm having a medical emergency or trying to clear a particularly stubborn piece of toast from my throat. I think I will stick to the modern silent version for the sake of social harmony.
Probably for the best. I tried it once, and I think I pulled a muscle in my throat. Being a sloth has its limitations, and pharyngeal consonants are definitely one of them.
Indeed it does. All right, let us get some coffee. I promise to order in perfectly standard, flattened, modern Hebrew. No ancient gutturals, I promise.
Well, see you, everyone.
Bye now.
You know, it is funny, though, how much Yiddish is still in there. Even if we think we are speaking pure Hebrew, the ghosts of the diaspora are everywhere. The way we shrug, the way we emphasize certain words, it is all there.
They are. Every time you say new or tatchels, you are channeling centuries of history. That is the beauty of it. It is a layered language, a legal lasagna, as we called the history of the land in episode 483.
A linguistic lasagna. I like that. Layers of history, all baked into one modern dish. It is messy, it is hot, and it is filling.
And now I am hungry. Let us go.
Lead the way. Thanks for listening, everyone. This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another deep dive into the strange and the fascinating.
Take care, everyone. Check out myweirdprompts.com for more.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Seriously, though, Heskett is a much better word than podcast. We should start using it. It sounds more official.
Good luck with that, Corn. I will stick with what people actually understand. I am a pragmatist, remember?
Fair enough. Pragmatism wins again. It is the Hebrew way.
Always does.
All right. Signing off for real this time.
Shalom.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth